Elijah Carter, a successful black CEO, faces a blatant and unjust arrest after defending a waitress from a racist customer, Martin Hayes, at a diner. Despite his achievements and integrity, Elijah becomes a target for systemic racism, with corrupt officers like Daniels and Hayes using their power to falsely accuse him of assault. As Elijah is harassed and manipulated by the police, he is forced to confront the prejudice that sees him as guilty by virtue of his skin color. Despite the truth being on his side, the story exposes the deeply ingrained biases that shape the justice system. Elijah Carter adjusted his tie in the reflection of the glass-paneled door, his crisp navy blue suit complementing his tall, athletic frame. The morning sun reflected off the polished logo etched into the entrance. Carter Innovations, the tech firm he had built from the ground up. The company was known for its pioneering AI technology, generating billions in revenue and reshaping industries. But Elijah was more than a CEO. He was a symbol of perseverance, a black man who had defied countless odds to stand at the pinnacle of success. Yet, as he pushed the door open and greeted the receptionist with a warm smile, Elijah carried himself with the humility of someone who remembered every step of his climb. The quiet resolve that had propelled him forward hadn't faded, even as accolades and invitations from Fortune 500 boards piled up. For all his wealth and influence, he still preferred driving his modest sedan, cooking his own meals, and mentoring young entrepreneurs who reminded him of his younger self. Today, however, Elijah wasn't here to discuss the next groundbreaking project or meet with stakeholders. He had stepped away from the polished offices and sleek boardrooms to visit a quaint diner on the edge of town, a small family-owned spot that held memories of simpler days. The bell above the door jingled as Elijah stepped inside Wanda's diner, the smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon greeting him like an old friend. The place hadn't changed in years. Red vinyl booths, checkered floors, and framed black and white photos of the town lining the walls. Elijah's gaze lingered on a picture of the diner's namesake, Wanda, smiling alongside her late husband. They had given him his first job as a dishwasher when he was just 15, teaching him the value of hard work and integrity. He chose a booth in the corner, far from the bustle of the counter. Elijah wasn't here for fanfare. He was here for a slice of Wanda's famous sweet potato pie and a bit of solitude. As he waited for the waitress to bring his order, Elijah glanced around. The diner was a microcosm of the town. Older patrons sipping coffee and trading stories, a couple of teens flipping through their phones, and a few workers on break. It was a place where everyone seemed to know everyone, a stark contrast to the fast-paced, impersonal world he usually navigated. The waitress arrived, a young woman with bright eyes and a nervous smile. "Good morning. What can I get you?" she asked, holding her notepad like it was a shield. Elijah smiled warmly. "Just a slice of pie and a coffee, please." "Coming right up," she replied, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer. As if trying to place him, Elijah was used to it. He had one of those faces that people swore they'd seen before, even if they couldn't figure out where. As the waitress moved away, the door jingled again, drawing Elijah's attention. A man stepped inside, his presence commanding the room in a way that wasn't entirely welcome. He was burly, mid-50s, with a bristly mustache and a demeanor that spoke of entitlement. His tailored jacket and polished shoes suggested wealth, but there was something about the way he carried himself, like he owned the space around him, that set Elijah on edge. The man scanned the room, his eyes lingering on the waitress, before he made his way to the counter. His voice carried above the hum of conversation. "Let's make this quick, sweetheart. I don't have all day." Elijah's brow furrowed slightly as he observed the interaction. The waitress, clearly flustered, fumbled with her notepad as she took his order. The man sighed loudly, tapping his fingers against the counter with exaggerated impatience. "This is why I don't come to places like this. Service is always slow." Elijah returned his gaze to the window, unwilling to let the man's rudeness disrupt his morning. But as the waitress brought the man's coffee, the situation escalated. "What is this?" the man demanded, holding up the cup as if it contained poison. "I said 2 sugars, not 1. Do you even listen?" The waitress stammered an apology, reaching for the sugar dispenser. The man waved her off, his tone dripping with condescension. "Forget it, I'll do it myself." God, is it that hard to find competent help these days? A murmur rippled through the diner, patrons exchanging uneasy glances but saying nothing. Elijah felt the familiar knot of frustration tighten in his chest. He had seen this scene play out too many times. A man like this, secure in his privilege, treating others as if they were beneath him. The waitress moved to another table, her face flushed as she tried to shake off the encounter. Elijah's coffee and pie arrived moments later, but he found his appetite fading. He took a sip of the coffee, his gaze fixed on the man at the counter, who was now loudly criticizing the diner's decor, to no one in particular. Elijah's phone buzzed on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. A message from his assistant, Michael, lit up the screen. "Board meeting rescheduled to 2 p.m. Let me know if you need anything." He typed a quick reply, but as he set the phone down, the man at the counter turned abruptly, his eyes landing on Elijah. A flicker of something, recognition perhaps, crossed the man's face before he smirked and sauntered over. "Well, well," the man began, standing over Elijah's booth with an air of false camaraderie. "You look like you don't belong here, businessman, huh?" Elijah met his gaze calmly. "I'm just here for some pie." The man chuckled, though there was no warmth in it. "Sure you are, let me guess. Passing through, looking for some authentic small-town charm, right?" Elijah said nothing, letting the man's assumptions hang in the air. The smirk on the man's face grew wider. "Must be nice, huh, driving through in your fancy car, looking down on places like this." "I grew up here," Elijah said evenly, his tone betraying none of the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Really? Didn't expect that. Guess you've done all right for yourself." Elijah nodded, taking another sip of his coffee. "I've been fortunate." The man leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "Well, let me give you some advice. Places like this, you've got to be tough people here. They don't respect you unless you make them." Elijah placed his cup down, meeting the man's gaze head-on. "Respect is earned, not demanded." The man's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. "Maybe, but some people don't deserve it, you know, like that girl over there." He nodded toward the waitress. "Can't even get a coffee order right. That's the problem these days, everyone's too soft." The knot in Elijah's chest tightened, but he kept his composure. "I think she's doing her best, maybe cut her some slack." The man scoffed, leaning back. "Typical, always making excuses for people who don't deserve it. Bet you've got a team of them working for you, don't you? Bet they're the ones who make you look good while you take the credit." Elijah's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "I don't think you know me well enough to make those assumptions." The man chuckled again, his tone dripping with derision. "Oh, I've seen your type before. Think you're better than the rest of us because you've got a nice suit and a big bank account. But let me tell you something, money doesn't change where you come from." Elijah leaned back in his seat, his eyes never leaving the man's. "You're right, it doesn't. But it also doesn't define who I am." The man's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of frustration. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the bell above the door jingled again. 2 uniformed police officers walked in, their eyes scanning the room. The 2 police officers stepped into Wanda's diner with the deliberate gait of people who knew their presence would draw attention. Their crisp uniforms seemed out of place in the cozy, lived-in ambiance of the diner. Conversations hushed, forks paused mid-air, and all eyes subtly turned toward them. Elijah instinctively glanced at the officers as they entered. He had no reason to feel uneasy, but experience had taught him that his existence alone was sometimes enough to attract suspicion. He leaned back in his seat, keeping his movements slow and deliberate, trying to shake off the unease creeping into his chest. The officers exchanged a quick word at the counter before turning toward the booths. One of them, a younger man with sandy hair and sharp blue eyes, locked onto Elijah. He nudged his partner, a stockier, older officer with a face etched in deep lines, and pointed in Elijah's direction. "Excuse me, sir," the younger officer called, his tone polite, but laced with the unmistakable edge of authority. Elijah raised an eyebrow, but kept his expression neutral. "Yes?" The 2 officers approached, the younger one stepping forward while the older officer stayed a step behind, his hand resting casually on his belt. "We've had a report about some suspicious activity in the area," the younger officer said. "Would you mind answering a few questions?" Elijah set his coffee cup down carefully, his movements precise. He felt the weight of the diner's collective gaze, every patron waiting to see what would happen next. "Suspicious activity?" Elijah asked, his voice calm. "What does that have to do with me?" The officer's gaze flicked to Elijah's suit and then to the briefcase leaning against the booth. "We received a call about someone matching your description acting out of place." "Out of place." The words hit with the subtlety of a knife sliding between ribs. Elijah kept his expression neutral, but a sharp flicker of irritation flared within him. "And what exactly does acting out of place mean?" Elijah asked. The older officer stepped forward now, his face hardening. "We're just doing our job, sir. It would help if you cooperate." Elijah took a breath, steadying himself. He'd been in situations like this before, situations where his authority, his success, his entire identity was reduced to an assumption based on the color of his skin. He wouldn't let them rattle him, but the frustration was difficult to keep at bay. "I'm having breakfast," Elijah said evenly. "That's all. If you're looking for something suspicious, I suggest you keep looking elsewhere." The younger officer glanced at his partner, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But the older officer leaned in, his voice lowering. "Look, we can make this easy, or we can make it difficult. We need to see some ID." Across the diner, Martin Hayes watched the scene unfold with an expression of thinly veiled satisfaction. The smirk on his face made Elijah's jaw tighten, but he kept his focus on the officers. "I'm not obligated to show you my ID, unless you have reason to believe I've committed a crime," Elijah said firmly. The younger officer hesitated, but the older one's expression hardened further. "We're not saying you've committed a crime, but we're investigating a report. It's a simple request." "Simple for you," Elijah said, his voice steady but carrying an edge now. "But not for someone who's asked to prove their right to exist in a place like this." The older officer stiffened. "Listen, pal, we're just trying to do our job." "Your job," Elijah said, the sharpness in his tone more pronounced now, "should be finding actual criminals, not harassing someone over a breakfast order." The air in the diner grew thicker with tension. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to proceed. But before either of them could respond, Martin Hayes stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I think I can help clear this up," Martin said, stepping forward with exaggerated confidence. Elijah turned his gaze on Martin, his calm exterior threatening to crack. "This man," Martin said, pointing at Elijah, "has been acting suspiciously since he walked in, sitting here in his fancy suit, looking like he's judging everyone. I don't know what he's doing, but it doesn't seem right." A murmur rippled through the diner, a mix of disbelief and curiosity. The officers exchanged glances, and the younger one finally spoke up. "Do you know this man?" he asked Martin. "No," Martin said quickly, "but I know his type, always thinking they're better than the rest of us." Elijah exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain seated. Rising to Martin's bait would only make things worse. Instead, he addressed the officers directly. "My name is Elijah Carter," he said, his tone measured. "I'm the CEO of Carter Innovations, a tech company headquartered downtown. You can Google me if you need proof of who I am, but this," he gestured subtly at the scene unfolding around him, "this is a waste of everyone's time." The younger officer pulled out his phone, hesitating for a moment before typing something into a search bar. The older officer watched Elijah warily, as if waiting for him to make the wrong move. "Holy," the younger officer muttered under his breath, his eyes widening slightly as he stared at the screen. He leaned toward his partner, whispering something too low for Elijah to hear. The older officer's expression shifted, the faintest hint of unease creeping into his features. "All right, Mr. Carter," the older officer said, his tone less aggressive now. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "A misunderstanding? Is that what we're calling it?" The older officer straightened, his professionalism snapping back into place. "We're just following up on a report, sir. You're free to go." "Free to go?" Elijah repeated, his voice quiet but cutting. "I was never not free to go." The officers turned to leave, but Martin wasn't finished. "So that's it?" he barked. "You're just going to let him off because he has money that doesn't prove anything?" Elijah rose from his seat now, the full weight of his presence silencing the room. He towered over Martin, his voice steady and deliberate. "Let me be clear," Elijah said, his eyes locked on Martin's. "You assumed I didn't belong here because of how I look. You called the police hoping they'd see me as a threat, just like you do. But your assumptions don't define me. They define you." Martin opened his mouth to respond, but Elijah didn't give him the chance. "Next time you think about calling the police on someone for no reason," Elijah continued, "remember this moment, because next time, the person you target might not have the means to defend themselves against your prejudice." The words hung in the air, heavy and unflinching. Martin's face reddened, but he said nothing. Elijah turned to the officers. "Do your job better," he said simply before walking out of the diner, leaving the tension behind him. Outside, the crisp air hit Elijah like a salve, but the frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior refused to dissipate. He leaned against his car for a moment, staring at the horizon as he tried to steady his breathing. This wasn't new. This wasn't surprising, but that didn't make it any less exhausting. As he got into his car and drove away, Elijah couldn't help but think about the people who weren't in his position. Those who didn't have a public profile or the resources to push back. He had escaped this encounter unscathed, but he knew the system wasn't designed to protect people like him. Not everyone would be so lucky. Elijah Carter drove away from Wanda's diner, his grip tight on the steering wheel. The encounter left a sour taste in his mouth, but it wasn't the first time he'd faced this kind of prejudice. What rattled him was the reminder of how quickly the system could turn against someone based solely on perception. He tried to focus on the day ahead, meetings, emails, and planning an upcoming philanthropic event. But his thoughts kept circling back to the officers, the entitlement in Martin's voice, and the unease that lingered like a stubborn shadow. Elijah's phone buzzed on the passenger seat, snapping him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Mitchell Thompson. Mitchell was the head of Carter Innovations' legal team, a sharp, level-headed lawyer who had been with Elijah since the company's inception. If Mitchell was calling, it wasn't just for small talk. Elijah tapped the hands-free button. "Mitchell, what's up?" "You're not going to like this," Mitchell said, his tone clipped. "I just got word that someone filed a complaint against you with the police." Elijah's chest tightened. "A complaint for what?" "Assault," Mitchell said, the word hanging heavy in the air. Elijah's jaw clenched. "That's ridiculous. I didn't lay a hand on anyone." "I know," Mitchell said quickly. "But they're claiming otherwise. I'm still piecing together the details. But from what I've gathered, it's the guy from the diner, Martin Hayes." Elijah exhaled sharply, his frustration boiling over. "Unbelievable, the man was harassing the waitress, and I'm the one being accused of assault?" Mitchell sighed. "It gets worse. Hayes is claiming you threatened him too. Given your profile, the media might pick up on this. I've already started drafting a response, but I need to know everything that happened." Elijah recounted the events at the diner as calmly as he could, but his voice betrayed the simmering anger beneath. Mitchell listened intently, asking a few clarifying questions before letting out a long breath. "This is a hit job," Mitchell said. "He's trying to smear you, probably to cover his own behavior. We'll handle it, but you need to be prepared. If the police take this seriously, they might push for an arrest." Elijah's stomach dropped. "An arrest for something I didn't do?" "It's not about guilt," Mitchell said grimly. "It's about optics, and right now, Hayes is playing the victim card hard. Stay where you are. I'm heading to the precinct now to get ahead of this." Elijah parked outside his office, but he couldn't bring himself to go inside. His usual calm resolve was shaken, and he found himself staring blankly at the city skyline. He had spent years building his reputation, his company, and his life around principles of integrity and respect. Yet here he was, facing the possibility of having it all tarnished by one man's lies. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from an unknown number. "We know what you did. You won't get away with it." Elijah's hand tightened around the phone. The message was vague, but the implication was clear. Someone wanted him to feel cornered. The sound of sirens pulled him from his thoughts. Looking in his rearview mirror, Elijah saw a police cruiser pulling into the lot behind him. His pulse quickened as two officers stepped out and began walking toward his car. One of them, a tall, stern-faced man with a rigid posture, knocked on Elijah's window. "Mr. Carter?" Elijah rolled down the window, forcing himself to remain composed. "Yes?" "I'm Officer Daniels," the man said. His voice was steady, but his eyes held a faint glint of judgment. We need to ask you a few questions about an incident reported this morning. Elijah nodded slowly. I assume this is about Martin Hayes. Daniels exchanged a glance with his partner, a younger officer who seemed less certain about the situation. We just need to get your side of the story. Elijah opened his door and stepped out, standing tall. I'm happy to cooperate, but let's be clear, this is a baseless accusation. Daniels smirked faintly, his hand hovering near his belt. We'll determine that. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Carter, would you mind coming down to the precinct to clear this up? Elijah raised an eyebrow. Am I under arrest? Not yet, Daniels said, his tone sharp. Elijah exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to let his frustration show. Then I'll follow you to the precinct, but let me make one thing clear. I won't tolerate being treated like a criminal for something I didn't do. At the precinct, Elijah was led into a small interrogation room. The stark fluorescent lighting buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the gray walls. Daniels sat across from him, his expression unreadable, while another officer stood by the door. You seem pretty sure of yourself, Daniels said, leaning back in his chair. I have no reason not to be, Elijah replied evenly. Daniels raised an eyebrow. You're aware of the accusations against you, right? Elijah nodded. I am, and they're completely false. Daniels smirked. Funny how that's what everyone says when they're caught. Elijah's composure cracked slightly. Caught doing what? Officer Daniels having breakfast standing up to a man who was verbally abusing a waitress? Daniels leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Hayes says you threatened him, that you got physical. That's a lie, Elijah said firmly. Maybe, Daniels said, shrugging. But Hayes is a respected businessman. His word carries weight. Elijah's jaw tightened. And mine doesn't? Daniels said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. The door opened suddenly, and Mitchell strode in, his presence commanding. He carried a briefcase and a look that could slice through steel. This interview is over, Mitchell said sharply, placing a hand on Elijah's shoulder. My client won't answer another question without legal counsel present. Daniels frowned, but didn't argue. Fine, but this isn't over. Mitchell ignored him, guiding Elijah out of the room and into the hallway. They're fishing, Mitchell said, once they were out of earshot. They don't have anything solid, but they're hoping to shake you enough to slip up. Elijah shook his head, the frustration boiling over. This is insane. They're treating me like a criminal because Hayes couldn't handle being called out. Mitchell nodded grimly. That's exactly what's happening, but we're going to turn this around. I've already got a plan. As they left the precinct, Elijah's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the countless others who had been in his position without the resources to fight back. The stakes were high, and the odds felt stacked against him. But Elijah wasn't about to back down. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The following days felt like a whirlwind. Elijah Carter barely slept, his mind racing with the implications of what had happened. The police's treatment of him, the baseless accusations from Martin Hayes, and the quiet but growing smear campaign. It all added up to something far bigger than just a personal grievance. This was about a system that was broken, one that used its power to make people like him feel invisible, or worse, guilty by default. By the time the weekend arrived, the situation had reached a boiling point. News outlets had picked up on the alleged assault at the diner, though they were careful to tiptoe around the full details. Headlines screamed things like, Tech CEO involved in diner incident, and unseen side of local business leader, a conflict in a small-town diner. The articles painted Elijah as a man who had lost his temper and gotten physical, a stereotype that couldn't be further from the truth. Mitchell was on the phone with media representatives, trying to contain the damage, but Elijah knew it was only a matter of time before the allegations gained traction. There was no way to fight an unseen enemy, one that was rooted in perception and fueled by bias. Elijah felt his chest tighten every time a headline flashed across his phone screen. It was as if the world was trying to strip him of the very things he had worked so hard to build. The knock on Elijah's office door was a momentary interruption, but it seemed louder than ever. He looked up, meeting Mitchell's tired but determined gaze. I just got off the phone with the chief, Mitchell said, taking a seat across from Elijah. It's escalating. They're getting pressure from higher up to pursue charges. They're talking about making this criminal, not just civil. Elijah exhaled slowly, his mind already racing. They can't be serious, I didn't do anything wrong. Mitchell's brow furrowed. I don't know if they care. You've become a target, Hayes is making sure of it. He's playing the victim, and it's working. They're pushing for an arrest. Elijah clenched his fists under the table. The truth didn't matter to them. This wasn't about facts or evidence. It was about the narrative that had already been set in motion. They won't get away with this, Elijah said, his voice firm, though his heart raced. I won't let them. Later that afternoon, Elijah found himself in the back of a black SUV, headed for a meeting with his PR team. Mitchell had insisted that they start getting ahead of the situation. But Elijah's thoughts were far from the strategies they would discuss. His mind kept returning to the same question. Why? Why was he being targeted? It wasn't just about the incident at the diner anymore. It was about the system that allowed a man like Martin Hayes, privileged, entitled, and unscrupulous, to wield power simply because of who he was and who he knew. It was the same system that saw a man like Elijah, who had built his life with integrity, as someone who needed to prove himself over and over again, no matter how much success he achieved. The car pulled up to a sleek office building, the glass windows reflecting the late afternoon sun. Elijah was greeted by his PR team, led by Claire, a seasoned expert who had navigated crises with elegance. She immediately launched into a series of strategies, talking points, media engagement, interviews that might help regain control of the narrative. But Elijah didn't hear any of it. His mind kept drifting to the same conclusion. There was no way out unless he took control of this himself. That night, as Elijah sat alone in his office, the glow of the city outside reflected in his eyes, he made a decision. He wouldn't hide behind lawyers or publicists. He would make a stand. The phone call came just after midnight. Mr. Carter! Mitchell's voice was strained. We've got a problem. What happened? Elijah asked, feeling the blood drain from his face. They've got a warrant, Mitchell said, the words heavy in the air. They're coming to arrest you. The next morning, the knock on the door of Elijah's penthouse apartment wasn't a surprise. It was a moment that had been building since the incident at the diner, and now it had finally arrived. The police were here, and Elijah's world was about to be turned upside down. Elijah stood in front of the door, his hand gripping the handle. The confrontation he'd been dreading was finally here. He wasn't going to go down without a fight, but the reality was setting in. This wasn't just about an arrest. This was about sending a message. The system had found its scapegoat, and Elijah had been chosen. The door swung open, and two officers stepped inside. One was the same younger officer from the diner. The other was a man Elijah didn't recognize. Both were armed and appeared tense, though the younger officer seemed uncomfortable with the situation. Mr. Carter? The older officer asked. Yes, Elijah replied, keeping his tone steady. You're under arrest for assault and attempted intimidation, the officer said flatly. Elijah took a deep breath. This is a mistake. The officer shook his head. The warrant was issued. You'll have your day in court. The younger officer, who had been silent until now, looked at Elijah with a hint of hesitation, as though he wasn't fully convinced of the arrest's legitimacy. Elijah caught the officer's eye for a brief moment and saw the conflict in his gaze. He didn't know if the younger officer was on his side, but Elijah knew one thing. The system was too far gone to count on any one person to make a difference. As the older officer reached for his handcuffs, Elijah's mind snapped into focus. This wasn't just about him. This wasn't even about Martin Hayes. This was about a broken system that had placed too many people like Elijah in this position, where they were guilty until proven innocent. He wasn't going to be a victim. Elijah's resolve hardened. I will cooperate with you, he said, his voice calm but unwavering. But you need to understand something. I didn't commit any crime. This is all a lie, and I'm going to prove it. The officers didn't respond, instead, beginning to place the cuffs on him. Elijah's breath slowed, his mind racing through his options. There were so many pieces in play now, so many people who had a stake in making sure he didn't succeed. But he wouldn't back down. Not this time. At the precinct, the room felt cold and sterile, as if it had been designed to intimidate. Elijah sat on a bench, his wrists still cuffed, his eyes fixed ahead. He wasn't afraid, but the weight of the situation settled over him like a blanket of injustice. Mitchell arrived shortly after, his face grim. The two exchanged a brief look. There was no need for words, they both knew what was at stake. "They're pushing hard for this," Mitchell said quietly, taking a seat next to him. "The chief is under pressure to close this case quickly. They're trying to make an example out of you." Elijah clenched his fists. "I didn't do anything wrong, Mitchell. But it doesn't matter. They're already writing the narrative. It's all about power and control." Mitchell nodded. "We have to get ahead of this. We need to expose what's really going on. There's more at play here than just one man's lies. This is systemic." Elijah looked up at him, determination settling in. "I'm not just going to fight this in court. I'm going to expose the corruption." Mitchell's eyes widened slightly. "Elijah, we need to be careful. If you go public—" "I'm done being careful," Elijah interrupted, his voice unwavering. "It's time they see what's really happening here. I'm going to fight back, I have to." The following days felt like a whirlwind. Elijah Carter barely slept, his mind racing with the implications of what had happened. The police's treatment of him, the baseless accusations from Martin Hayes, and the quiet but growing smear campaign, it all added up to something far bigger than just a personal grievance. This was about a system that was broken, one that used its power to make people like him feel invisible, or worse, guilty by default. By the time the weekend arrived, the situation had reached a boiling point. News outlets had picked up on the alleged assault at the diner. Though they were careful to tiptoe around the full details, headlines screamed things like, "Tech CEO involved in diner incident," and "Unseen side of local business leader, a conflict in a small-town diner." The articles painted Elijah as a man who had lost his temper and gotten physical, a stereotype that couldn't be further from the truth. Mitchell was on the phone with media representatives, trying to contain the damage, but Elijah knew it was only a matter of time before the allegations gained traction. There was no way to fight an unseen enemy, one that was rooted in perception and fueled by bias. Elijah felt his chest tighten every time a headline flashed across his phone screen. It was as if the world was trying to strip him of the very things he had worked so hard to build. The knock on Elijah's office door was a momentary interruption, but it seemed louder than ever. He looked up, meeting Mitchell's tired but determined gaze. "I just got off the phone with the chief," Mitchell said, taking a seat across from Elijah. "It's escalating. They're getting pressure from higher up to pursue charges. They're talking about making this criminal, not just civil." Elijah exhaled slowly, his mind already racing. "They can't be serious. I didn't do anything wrong." Mitchell's brow furrowed. "I don't know if they care. You've become a target. Hayes is making sure of it. He's playing the victim, and it's working. They're pushing for an arrest." Elijah clenched his fists under the table. The truth didn't matter to them. This wasn't about facts or evidence. It was about the narrative that had already been set in motion. "They won't get away with this," Elijah said, his voice firm, though his heart raced. "I won't let them." Later that afternoon, Elijah found himself in the back of a black SUV, headed for a meeting with his PR team. Mitchell had insisted that they start getting ahead of the situation. But Elijah's thoughts were far from the strategies they would discuss. His mind kept returning to the same question. Why? Why was he being targeted? It wasn't just about the incident at the diner anymore. It was about the system that allowed a man like Martin Hayes, privileged, entitled, and unscrupulous, to wield power simply because of who he was and who he knew. It was the same system that saw a man like Elijah, who had built his life with integrity, as someone who needed to prove himself over and over again, no matter how much success he achieved. The car pulled up to a sleek office building, the glass windows reflecting the late afternoon sun. Elijah was greeted by his PR team, led by Claire, a seasoned expert who had navigated crises with elegance. She immediately launched into a series of strategies, talking points, media engagement, interviews that might help regain control of the narrative. But Elijah didn't hear any of it. His mind kept drifting to the same conclusion. There was no way out unless he took control of this himself. That night, as Elijah sat alone in his office, the glow of the city outside reflected in his eyes, he made a decision. He wouldn't hide behind lawyers or publicists. He would make a stand. The phone call came just after midnight. "Mr. Carter," Mitchell's voice was strained. "We've got a problem." "What happened?" Elijah asked, feeling the blood drain from his face. "They've got a warrant," Mitchell said, the words heavy in the air. "They're coming to arrest you." The next morning, the knock on the door of Elijah's penthouse apartment wasn't a surprise. It was a moment that had been building since the incident at the diner, and now it had finally arrived. The police were here, and Elijah's world was about to be turned upside down. Elijah stood in front of the door, his hand gripping the handle. The confrontation he'd been dreading was finally here. He wasn't going to go down without a fight, but the reality was setting in. This wasn't just about an arrest, this was about sending a message. The system had found its scapegoat, and Elijah had been chosen. The door swung open, and two officers stepped inside. One was the same younger officer from the diner, the other was a man Elijah didn't recognize. Both were armed and appeared tense, though the younger officer seemed uncomfortable with the situation. "Mr. Carter?" the older officer asked. "Yes," Elijah replied, keeping his tone steady. "You're under arrest for assault and attempted intimidation," the officer said flatly. Elijah took a deep breath. "This is a mistake." The officer shook his head. "The warrant was issued. You'll have your day in court." The younger officer, who had been silent until now, looked at Elijah with a hint of hesitation, as though he wasn't fully convinced of the arrest's legitimacy. Elijah caught the officer's eye for a brief moment and saw the conflict in his gaze. He didn't know if the younger officer was on his side, but Elijah knew one thing. The system was too far gone to count on any one person to make a difference. As the older officer reached for his handcuffs, Elijah's mind snapped into focus. This wasn't just about him. This wasn't even about Martin Hayes. This was about a broken system that had placed too many people like Elijah in this position, where they were guilty until proven innocent. He wasn't going to be a victim. Elijah's resolve hardened. "I will cooperate with you," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "But you need to understand something. I didn't commit any crime. This is all a lie, and I'm going to prove it." The officers didn't respond, instead, beginning to place the cuffs on him. Elijah's breath slowed, his mind racing through his options. There were so many pieces in play now, so many people who had a stake in making sure he didn't succeed. But he wouldn't back down. Not this time. At the precinct, the room felt cold and sterile, as if it had been designed to intimidate. Elijah sat on a bench, his wrists still cuffed, his eyes fixed ahead. He wasn't afraid, but the weight of the situation settled over him, like a blanket of injustice. Mitchell arrived shortly after, his face grim. The two exchanged a brief look. There was no need for words, they both knew what was at stake. "They're pushing hard for this," Mitchell said quietly, taking a seat next to him. "The chief is under pressure to close this case quickly. They're trying to make an example out of you." Elijah clenched his fists. "I didn't do anything wrong, Mitchell. But it doesn't matter. They're already writing the narrative. It's all about power and control." Mitchell nodded. "We have to get ahead of this. We need to expose what's really going on. There's more at play here than just one man's lies. This is systemic." Elijah looked up at him, determination settling in. "I'm not just going to fight this in court. I'm going to expose the corruption." Mitchell's eyes widened slightly. "Elijah, we need to be careful. If you go public—" "I'm done being careful," Elijah interrupted, his voice unwavering. "It's time they see what's really happening here. I'm going to fight back. I have to." To be continued. This section heightens the conflict, bringing Elijah to the brink of arrest while revealing the systemic corruption at play. Elijah's inner resolve solidifies as he prepares to take matters into his own hands, setting the stage for the story's pivotal confrontation. Let me know when you're ready for Prompt 6. 4.0 Miniban, Ja Noi. In this section, focus on the climactic confrontation where the protagonist takes a stand or fights back against the injustice they face. Write approximately 1,500 words. Focus areas for this section: direct confrontation. Highlight a face-to-face showdown between the protagonist and the antagonist, e.g., Officer Daniels or a similar figure. This could involve a dramatic verbal exchange or even a physical confrontation, depending on the situation. Revelation. Introduce a key moment where the antagonist's true nature or intentions are exposed, showing the depths of their prejudice or corruption. This revelation should add to the gravity of the conflict, protagonist's strength. Show the protagonist using their skills, training, or strategic thinking to turn the situation in their favor. Emphasize their resilience and determination. High stakes make the audience feel the weight of the confrontation. Whether the protagonist succeeds or faces setbacks, the stakes should feel life-changing. End with uncertainty. Conclude this section with a pivotal decision or an unresolved moment that keeps the audience engaged for the resolution in the next section. Instructions. Write this section to deliver the emotional and narrative peak of the story. When finished, confirm readiness to proceed to prompt 7 for the resolution and aftermath. ChatGPT Genoi. ChatGPT. Here's the climactic confrontation, building the emotional and narrative peak of the story. The CEO who faced a humbling encounter that changed everything, continued. Elijah stood at the heart of the precinct, his wrists still bound by the cold steel of handcuffs, the harsh fluorescent lights above, casting a sterile glow on the sterile surroundings. He was a far cry from the polished CEO who ran a multi-billion-dollar tech company. Here, he was just another black man caught in a system that had long since stopped caring about the truth. Mitchell stood beside him, his usually unflappable demeanor now edged with urgency. "Elijah, we need to make sure the media is ready for this," he said quietly. "Once they process you, they'll likely leak your arrest. We have to control the narrative." Elijah nodded, though his mind was far from the press. He had spent years building something he was proud of. But now, everything was slipping through his fingers. Everything he had worked for, every ounce of energy he had poured into building his reputation, now stood on the precipice. Then, the door to the small interrogation room opened. Officer Daniels walked in, his face set in that grim, arrogant mask Elijah had grown all too familiar with. Behind him stood the younger officer, who still seemed uncomfortable with the whole situation, but it was Daniels who held the power in this moment. He was the one who had the authority to decide Elijah's fate, and that was exactly what he intended to do. "Mr. Carter," Daniels said, his voice dripping with the false civility that only masked his disdain, "I trust you understand the gravity of your situation." Elijah stood tall, forcing down the surge of anger that threatened to break through. "I understand that you're making a huge mistake, Officer Daniels." Daniels smirked, taking a step closer. "Is that so? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're the one who's made a mistake, lashing out at someone who's simply trying to help." Elijah met his gaze, unflinching. "I didn't lash out. I called out a man who was harassing a waitress and spreading hate. I don't care if he's a respected businessman like you think he is, his behavior was inexcusable." Daniel's eyes hardened. "Funny how you don't take responsibility for your actions. Though a man like you..." He leaned in close, his voice low. "You think you can do whatever you want, because you've built a nice little empire for yourself. But this isn't your world, Carter. Not the one where you get to do whatever you want without consequences." The words hit Elijah like a slap, and for a moment, he was reminded of the reality he had always known, the subtle prejudice that had followed him through every step of his career, even as he'd earned his place at the top. "You don't know anything about me," Elijah said, his voice steady, but brimming with the quiet fire that had gotten him to where he was. "But I know about you, Officer Daniels. I know how you see people like me. You think I'm just another black man who's supposed to be grateful for the scraps you throw me, but that's not how this works." Daniels stepped back, his smirk faltering as he tried to regain his control over the situation. The younger officer, still lingering in the background, shifted uncomfortably on his feet, clearly torn between duty and what seemed like a budding realization of the injustice unfolding before him. Elijah continued, his voice rising with the passion that had been building in his chest. "I've spent my life proving myself, fighting to earn respect in a world that told me I would never make it. But I see what you're doing, Daniels. You're weaponizing this system. You've already made up your mind that I'm guilty because I'm a black man, standing here in a suit, trying to make something of myself. You've seen the color of my skin, and now you want to make sure that the system works for you, not for me." Daniel's eyes flickered with an unreadable emotion, but it wasn't guilt, not by a long shot. "You're wrong," Daniel said, his voice tight now. "I don't care what color your skin is, but I do care about people who make trouble. You think you can walk into a diner and challenge someone like Hayes without consequences? You think you can just play hero for the sake of some moral high ground? I wasn't playing hero, Elijah shot back, his fists clenching in the cuffs. I was standing up for what's right. You, on the other hand, are doing what you always do, perpetuating a broken system that lets men like Hayes win, while people like me are thrown in jail for trying to protect others. Daniels's face darkened. You're smarter than that, Carter. This isn't about right and wrong, it's about control. He turned toward the younger officer. You see, it's always about control. Always about who gets to decide the narrative, who gets to tell the story, and right now, I'm telling the story, not you. The younger officer, who had remained silent up until this point, spoke hesitantly. Daniels, maybe we should think this through. Daniels shot him a glare, silencing him immediately. Stay out of it. But the younger officer's hesitation didn't go unnoticed by Elijah. There was a crack in the armor, a subtle but significant shift. The young officer looked at Elijah with an expression that was somewhere between doubt and sympathy, a glance that said more than words ever could. This moment of vulnerability didn't escape Elijah. He recognized the tension in the younger officer's eyes. He saw a man trapped between doing his job and knowing that what was happening in that room was wrong. But Elijah couldn't rely on that officer to be his salvation. He had to make his own stand. You're right, Elijah said, his voice cool but resolute. It is about control, but what you don't realize, Daniels, is that you're losing it. You've pushed me to the edge, and now you're going to see exactly what happens when someone like me decides to take control of their own fate. Daniels's brow furrowed, but Elijah didn't give him a chance to respond. He turned to the younger officer. You can either be part of the problem or part of the solution. You've already seen where this is going. Don't let him drag you down with him. The younger officer swallowed hard, but didn't speak. Elijah could see the conflict in his eyes, but he knew he couldn't wait for him to make a choice. He had to take action now. With a deep breath, Elijah shifted his focus back to Daniels. I'm done playing by your rules. You've already written your story, but now it's time to write mine. Just as Elijah was about to speak again, the door burst open. A group of officers entered, led by none other than Officer Hayes, the very man who had started this entire chain of events. His presence in the room wasn't just symbolic, it was a blatant act of intimidation. He walked toward Elijah, his eyes filled with thinly veiled triumph. I see we're getting serious now, Hayes said with a smirk. This is your last chance, Carter. You're going to regret this. You can't fight the system. It'll swallow you whole. Elijah met his gaze directly, his resolve unshaken. I've spent my life fighting for what I believe in, Hayes. And now, I'm fighting back against you. The tension in the room reached its breaking point. Elijah felt a cold, hard clarity in his chest. This wasn't just about defending himself anymore. This was about a larger fight, one that would reverberate far beyond these walls. He wasn't just going to survive this encounter, he was going to make sure the truth was heard. Hayes took a step closer, his hands trembling slightly as his fury began to bubble over. You think you can stand here and lecture me? You think you can take me down? Elijah stood tall, his voice sharp. I'm not lecturing you, Hayes. I'm exposing you for all the world to see. Suddenly, the lights flickered. The tension seemed to crackle in the air like electricity, as if the entire room were about to explode. Elijah knew the stakes were high. He knew that the consequences of what he was about to do could change his life forever. But in that moment, with everything on the line, he wasn't afraid. His fate wasn't just in his hands anymore, it was in his mind, his voice, and his will. Elijah Carter was about to make the biggest stand of his life, and he wasn't backing down. Elijah sat in the cold, sterile interrogation room, his hands still bound in cuffs, though the weight of his situation was heavier than the restraints themselves. The fluorescent lights above buzzed, adding an eerie hum to the already tense atmosphere. He had been here too long, subjected to endless questioning, all for a crime he did not commit. The feeling of injustice was suffocating, but deep down, Elijah knew he wasn't alone in this fight. There were forces at work now, and he wasn't about to back down. The door opened abruptly, and Officer Daniels stepped in, his eyes narrowing as he saw Elijah still seated, unbroken. Elijah's gaze met his directly, unwavering. You're still here, Daniels said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're a real piece of work, Carter. Thought you'd be smarter than this." Elijah didn't flinch. "You want to get smart with me, Daniels? Or do you want to talk about the truth?" Daniels' lips twisted into a thin smile, his posture stiffening. He had been the one to lead this charge against Elijah, pushing the narrative that he was guilty without a shred of evidence. Now, as the hours ticked by, his confidence seemed to be fraying at the edges. "You've been playing this game too long, Carter," Daniels said, his voice lowering, heavy with something Elijah couldn't quite pinpoint. Perhaps it was the bitter edge of realization. "You think you're untouchable? Because you've got money, power, a nice suit. But in the end, people like you are the problem. You think you can just walk into a diner, make a scene, and nothing will happen to you. You really thought the system was going to back you up, huh?" Elijah sat up straighter, every word that came from Daniel's mouth feeding a fire inside him that had been smoldering since the first moment this whole ordeal began. The audacity, the ignorance, the sheer arrogance of it all. He wasn't going to let it slide anymore. "No," Elijah said, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "I didn't think I was untouchable, but I also didn't think people like you would use the system as a weapon to bring me down." Daniels scoffed, running a hand through his hair as he stepped closer. "You're just another black man who thinks he can play the hero. You think you're some kind of savior. Get over yourself, Carter. You're not going to win this. Not here. Not with me." Elijah's heart was pounding, but his mind was clear. He knew this man's game. He'd played it before, watched it unfold countless times from the other side. Daniels wasn't just a corrupt officer. He was the embodiment of a system that was meant to hold power in the hands of those who could manipulate it. And Elijah was done being part of that system's ugly cycle. "I'm not playing a game, Daniels," Elijah said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm standing up to a system that wants to punish people like me, and I'm not going down without making sure everyone sees it." Daniel's face darkened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "You're out of your mind if you think I'll let you walk out of here, Carter. You're guilty as sin, and you're going to pay for what you did." "I didn't do anything wrong," Elijah shot back, his words sharp. "What I did was call out a racist man who thought he could get away with spewing hate, and now you're using the power you have to bury the truth." Daniel's eyes flashed with a dark glint of frustration. "You've got a mouth on you, don't you? You think people will just listen to you because of your position, your money, your—" He paused, his gaze flicking over Elijah's suit. "You think that makes you special?" Elijah leaned forward, a fire igniting within him. "No, Daniels. What makes me special is that I won't let you win. You're so wrapped up in your own prejudices that you can't see the truth. You're so caught up in your own power that you forget people like me, people with integrity, will fight for what's right." There was a long pause between them. The words Elijah had spoken hung in the air like a challenge. Daniel's face twisted as if he were trying to process what Elijah had just said. But before he could respond, there was a sharp knock on the door. The door opened, and another officer stepped in. This time, it was Officer Hayes, the man who had set this entire situation in motion. Elijah could see the smug look on Hayes's face as he strode into the room, his confidence only adding fuel to the fire of Elijah's resolve. "How's it going, Carter?" Hayes asked with an exaggerated sweetness. "Everything okay? I trust Officer Daniels has been treating you well." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "You," he said, his voice steady, "are the one who started all of this. You're the one who lied and made false accusations, and now you're using the power of the police to try to destroy me." Hayes's smile never faltered. "Well, you've certainly made a mess of things, haven't you? But you know, I didn't think you'd go this far. I thought you'd just slink away with your tail between your legs, like the rest of them." Elijah's hands clenched tighter. He was done letting people like Hayes walk over him. "I've fought my whole life to build what I have, and I'm not going to let you destroy it over a lie. You're the one who's going to answer for this, Hayes, not me." Hayes stepped closer, his face a mask of feigned concern. "You really don't get it, do you, Carter? This isn't about you. It's about keeping things in line. It's about making sure people like you understand that they can't break the rules and get away with it." Elijah stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "No, this is about you trying to control the narrative. You want to keep people like me in check, to make sure we stay in our place." "Well, I'm not going anywhere, Hayes. And you're going to regret underestimating me. The tension in the room was palpable. Daniels and Hayes were both glaring at Elijah, their arrogance beginning to slip into anger. Elijah knew he was walking a fine line, but he was done playing by their rules. He had worked too hard, come too far to let them destroy his reputation with false accusations. You think you can just walk away from this, Carter? Daniels sneered, taking a step closer, his hand tightening on his belt. You think you're too good for this? We'll see about that. Elijah didn't flinch. You can try to break me, Daniels, but you won't, and when this is all over, everyone will see exactly what you're trying to do. They'll see you for what you really are. The younger officer, who had been standing in the corner, finally spoke up, his voice tentative but filled with an unexpected weight. Daniels, Hayes, maybe we should think this through. I mean, this is getting out of hand. Daniels whipped around, his face flushing with fury. Stay out of it, Matthews, he growled. You don't know what you're talking about. But Matthews didn't back down. I do know what I'm talking about, he said, his voice more confident now. And I don't think this is right. This doesn't feel right. Elijah turned to Matthews, recognizing the flicker of doubt in the officer's eyes. There was a chance he wasn't going to let it slip by. You know what's right, Matthews. You can see it. You know this isn't justice. Matthews hesitated, the weight of his choices clear on his face. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. For a brief moment, it seemed like Matthews might speak out, but then Daniels intervened. Enough of this, Daniels barked, his voice low and dangerous. You want to fight, fine, but you're fighting alone. Matthews backed away, but his eyes remained locked on Elijah, torn between the duty he had sworn to uphold and the reality that was staring him in the face. Elijah's heart raced, but he wasn't done yet. This wasn't just about standing up to Daniels and Hayes. It was about something bigger. It was about showing everyone, especially Matthews, that people like Elijah were not the enemy. It was the corrupt system they had built that was the true enemy.